Hey guys, have you ever noticed a clicking sound from the front end of your motorcycle while turning the bars especially? It can happen while you're sitting on it standing still or slowly moving. Don't worry, it's totally normal. Let me show you what it is. I first heard that noise on this bike just a little while ago, and this video is kind of spurred on by a question I got from a viewer asking if I had any noise from my rotors. And at the time I answered him no, because I didn't. But now I do, and I can show you exactly what is causing it. First of all, it's not a cause for any kind of concern. It is a completely normal noise. Now bear in mind that's not the only thing. What I'm going to show you is not the only thing that can cause clunks from the front end. You may very well have a suspension issue or a steering head bearing issue, but that's not really going to manifest itself by turning the bars like I showed you. This is pretty much the only thing that's going to do that. So what the heck is the problem? Well, it's not a problem. It's a feature. It's a byproduct of a feature called floating rotors. Most bikes these days are marketed with what are called floating rotors. These are the brake rotors here. These are the discs called on cars, rotors termed on bikes. What the heck does floating mean? Well, first of all, these are not true floating rotors, even though almost every manufacturer out there, every street bike that I'm aware of, calls them floating rotors, but they're not really true floating rotors. They're actually called, more accurately, semi-floating rotors. First of all, a standard rotor, which is this steel part here, is directly bolted to the carrier, which is this inner part here. That kind of thing is still found on cheap bikes, really inexpensive bikes, because it's inexpensive to produce. The parts are just stamped and they're screwed together, or they're bolted together, or they're one piece, and that's it. The problem is the materials are different. These are steel, all right? These take a beating. These are what your brake pads are rubbing up against, and they last a hell of a long time. The insides are often aluminum, because you don't need all that extra weight and durability of steel on the carrier or on any part of the wheels themselves. The wheels themselves need to be very light, so they're made usually of aluminum. When you have different kinds of metals directly contacting each other, so if it's directly bolted to a piece here where you have steel and aluminum, what happens is when the steel heats up from braking, when it's heating up and cooling down, it's doing so at a different rate than this piece here. So if these are in direct contact, you have different cooling, different expansion and contraction rates, and that's what gives you warped rotors. And that gives you the vibration when you're trying to stop. Just like warped rotors in a car, same kind of feel. But obviously with a bike, that's really, really bad. So you never want to have warped rotors on a bike, and it's extremely rare because bikes use a semi-floating rotor design. What does that mean? That means these two aren't actually directly attached to each other. They're not directly touching each other. What we have are these little rivets. They're hollow rivets. They're called buttons in the industry. And they're basically like the little grommets you see when you hang a sign or something like that. So they're hollow through the middle, and they're just, little squeezed out, punched out rivets. Okay, so these are not directly attached to each other. There's a thin little gap in between. It's cut right here with a little circle through the middle. So this is just kind of holding these two in place, not really holding them together. So that's why this is called a floating rotor, because it's really kind of floating in space, and these are just keeping it in position so it can't flop out to the inside or outside. Now a true floating rotor has these very, very loose, and you can grab this rotor and it can flop around. That's beneficial because that allows this to flop around when you're braking, so it's always self-centered inside the brake pads. So you have absolutely no resistance. It's free floating. It can go wherever it needs to. On a street, it doesn't really matter. If I were to take this bike off the ground right now and spin the front wheel, it would have a little bit of drag. The brake pads are going to be touching this just a little bit, and it would eventually stop in a couple seconds. But on a race bike where these were truly floating and allowed to flop around a lot more, it would free spin, because this would just have a lot more space in between the brake pads. But downside to that, it clanks around. They are noisy. If these are allowed to flop around, you can imagine the racket that this makes with all these rivets loose and this thing just clank, 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 clank. It sounds like you're dragging a big steel chain behind you. So that is never done on street bikes. No one would ever buy the thing. It would be so annoying. That's only for race bikes. So what you get on the street are called semi-floating rotors. They're rigidly mounted. I mean, you can't grab this and move it side to side at all, but they do move. They do have some movement. And if you grab it and kind of rotate it like a steering wheel, you get a tiny, tiny bit of movement because there is a gap. It's supposed to. This is the entire reason it's built like this. And what happens when you do that? You get the noise. I know it may be a little hard to hear because it's easier to do when the bike is making the noise, but hear it? That's it. That's what's causing your noise. Doesn't always happen. Happens usually when you go lock to lock, which of course is not a very common thing unless you're maneuvering like I was doing here in a garage. So that's it. Just this little movement of the semi-floating rotor is what makes that click noise. Absolutely nothing to be concerned about. There's nothing you need to do about it. No reason to visit the dealer. No reason to do any kind of maintenance. Good to go. All right, hope that helps somebody. Hope that answers some questions and alleviates some people's fears. Enjoy your bikes. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Give me a thumbs up. Visit the site, twowheelobsession.com. Share it with all your buddies. See ya.